Africa, a cradle of history, a land that went from light into a long darkness, a land whose people are now beginning to see the first rays of a new dawn. Here along Africa's northeastern coast are names and places rich in Christian history. It was to Egypt that the infant Jesus was carried to escape the wrath of Herod. From North Africa came Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross after Jesus fell on the road to Calvary. Here St. Augustine wrote principles of theology that have guided churches for centuries. And here Alexandria became a center of Christianity. Then came changes. Rome fell, and into Africa poured hordes of Vandals and Arab Mohammedans. The light of Christianity that might have spread to all of pagan Africa dimmed and vanished. So lay Africa for 1,000 years, the dark continent, unknown except to those who came to plunder it of gold, diamonds, and slaves. Then another change. Through the work of missionaries, Christianity was brought back to Africa, and enslaved people began to grasp at the freedom promised all men in the Word of God. And although there was still some barbarism, there were places where men who had lived long in darkness saw the dawn of a brighter day. One such place is Nigeria, with its 35 million Africans. Here, the Danish Sudan Mission and the Nigeria Mission of the American Lutheran Church seek to bring the 750,000 Muslims and pagans of their joint mission field to Christ, to strengthen the church, to train Christian leaders. Come with us now, see that work, and hear a story of how it is changing lives in far-off Nigeria. No, not mushrooms. These are houses, the mud and wattle huts typical of this land. To the African mind, a house does not look like a house unless it has this sort of round roof. And yet there is a contrast now, another of the changes that are coming to Africa. For more and more in the country's new dawn, you see another kind of roof, the shut spire pointing upward, the roof of the house of God. There are other contrasts in the fields. Men plow with oxen in the slow and patient way of centuries ago, and turn to watch a modern car, a herald of the age of machines. There are differences, too, in dress and ways of life. This could be a scene in biblical times, and the setting could almost be the Holy Land of long ago. And yet, not far away, Muslims kneel to say their noontime prayers toward Mecca. And in a village, grotesque devil dancers carry on orgiastic pagan rituals old as Africa. Truly, this is the continent of contrasts. And the story we are bringing to you concerns a change, a contrast, greater than any of these. In this car is a man who might have spent his life in the shadows of superstition and ignorance. But through the work of your missionaries, he has become a leader of his people, who now serves in an important government position as district officer over a large region. You can see the respect with which he is greeted as he returns to his home village. People kneel almost as if he were a king. But this respect is not engendered by fear. It is an expression of affection. And as the car enters the village, they look toward him with admiration, because they know that what he does for them is an expression of love, Christian love, even though only about 8% of them are Christians. A crowd has gathered to welcome him home, and a celebration has been arranged. Because he is so widely admired, everyone has come, from the devil dancers to the Boys' Brigade, the equivalent of the Boy Scouts in our own country. Now we are about to see the man who merits this affectionate attention. He is the tall man in the white robe. His name is Philip Maken. And in a minute or two, we will hear his life story. But first, let us follow the local chiefs to watch the homecoming celebration. Although Philip Maken is himself a Christian, most of the people of his land still celebrate in their ancient pagan manner. Let us leave the celebration and follow a missionary to Philip Maken's home to hear the story of how Christianity changed his life. Certainly, Philip says, he will be glad to tell his story. It will help the church and his people, too. First, though, he would like to present his wife and their baby. He is especially proud of his wife, for she, too, came up from darkness and ignorance through the message of the gospel. Now for the story. Tell it to me from the beginning, the missionary says, and I will write it down so our churches in America and Denmark will know of the work here in Nigeria. And so, in the English he learned at a mission school, Philip Maken tells of his life and the events that made him a leader of his people.
I was born in a village not far from here, a place called Gurum. My father was a farmer. I knew only such simple things as taking care of the sheep. I could not even read or write. My mother and my two little sisters were as ignorant as I was. None of us had ever seen a book. It was my job every morning to take the sheep out to graze and go with them all day long. This was a task I liked. Going out to the sheep gave me a chance to think the long, long thoughts of a boy about myself. When would I have sheep of my own? When would I have cattle? And when would I marry? And yet, through all my dreaming, I knew there was little chance that I would ever be more than I was then, a simple shepherd boy who could not even read. Perhaps this was why I sometimes took the sheep to a crossroads near my home. I knew that there, at a certain time in the morning, I could see other boys and girls on their way to a place they called school. I would watch them as they met on the way to that place, and I would compare them to myself. They knew 1,000 things that I would never know. Throughout their lives, they would have things I could never possess. I would forever remain what I was then, a poverty-stricken, ignorant tender of sheep, sitting beside the road like a beggar. Yes, I was even worse than a beggar, for no one could help me. You can toss a beggar a coin, but how can you toss an education to him? And yet, one morning, a wonderful thing happened. Some children ran past, hurrying lest they be late, and one of them dropped a book. It lay there in the dust, unnoticed by anyone but myself. The one who had dropped it would never miss it. I was sure I could get another one without any trouble. I know it was dishonest, and I hope heaven will forgive me. But I snatched the book as a thief might snatch a jewel. I made sure that the boy would not come back to claim his book. And then I looked at this jewel I had picked up from the road, this priceless thing that to me stood for school and education and all that went with them. And what did I see? Nothing. I could understand nothing at all. For many days and in many places, I carried that book with me as I watched my sheep. And perhaps I watched the sheep less than I watched the book, for I felt that if I looked long enough, I would understand it. And yet the understanding would not come. The meaning of it was a mystery, When my father found me looking at the book instead of the flock, he was angry with me. He told me to keep my mind on my work and leave such foolish things alone. But something inside me said this was not foolish, that if I only looked long enough, it would come to me. The knowledge did not come to me, and yet, perhaps with the help of God, a man came one day. He was a stranger, and he asked what I was reading. And of course, he soon found that I could not read at all. Some men might have laughed at me, but he did not. He showed me a little about writing, and then he told me that if I wanted to learn more, there was a way I could go to school. Then he asked where I lived and asked if I would take him there so he could talk to my father. And so, lest my father be angry with me once more for not watching the sheep, I got another boy to take care of the flock, and I took the stranger to my village. I was a little ashamed of my village and of the old man sitting outside the compound, but the stranger did not seem to mind. So I hurried to find my father and tell him someone wanted to see him. And then I spread a mat on the ground so he could sit as he talked about this wonderful idea that I might go to school. The talk went on a long time, because my father had always thought schools were too expensive for people like us. But the man explained that now the missions and the government were working together for better education, and I certainly could go. And so, in a few days, my father brought me to the school himself, and we both knelt before the headmaster. The headmaster said everything had been arranged by the missionary, and I was expected. So I said goodbye to my father and began my education. Then it was that there opened up to me a wonderful new world. Books were not mysteries any longer. Soon I could not only read, but also write. There, too, I learned to play. Not the pointless play of childhood, but games that taught fair play and obedience to rules. And almost too soon, I was ready to go away to a higher school, the one at Newman. There was a strange fondness in my father's handshake that day, and more love than ever on my mother's part. It was not only because I was going away, I think. It was because I, like the boys who were going with me, was stepping out into a great new life my parents would never know. I saw many things that surprised me when I arrived at Newman. Besides the schools, there was a hospital there, and I was astonished at first to see sick people being treated with such care and gentleness. For you see, I still did not know much about the Christian way of life. There was, I remember, a boy of about my age with an injured eye. At home he might have gone blind, but here, thanks to skilled treatment, he would recover his vision. And in a way, my own vision became better too. Because the longer I stayed there, the more I saw the meaning of Christian love. Here were white people, people of whom I had always been a little afraid, working on equal terms with those of my own race, devoting their lives to helping them. Furthermore, the missionaries were not trying to change my people in little unimportant ways. They didn't think it strange that we carry our burdens on our heads in the way that is easiest and most natural to us. They knew, I came to see, that it is what is inside the head and inside the heart that is most important. And inside the heads and hearts of the people who came, there was only love. That love seemed strongest when babies were concerned. And when I asked why, someone told me what Jesus said about letting the little children come unto him, because of such is the kingdom of heaven. So then, you see, I began to learn about Jesus and heaven too. I began to see that all this work was carrying on the teachings of Jesus. Day after day, I saw the sick and afflicted coming for help, bringing what little they had in food and firewood. And I saw that it was like the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Sometimes I would watch men like Dr. Hunter Smith, and I saw that they were not only using modern medicine to replace witch doctors' methods, but showing in 1,000 ways that the love of Jesus leads us to the only true God. I learned even after classes, for in the dormitory, one of the older students would sometimes talk to us about Jesus. And in Sunday school and Bible classes, my knowledge was increased all the time. I began to see that these teachings of Jesus could be applied to the whole world, that there could be peace among our warring tribes, between all whites and all Africans, even among all nations everywhere. I began to want to be one of the peacemakers Jesus called the sons of God in the Bible I was now learning to read. I found myself going to every service at the Lutheran church so I could fill my heart with everything there was to know about Jesus. And I began to study for baptism. At last, after many months, I was ready for the greatest event of my life. Where once I was a shepherd boy, living in the shadows of fearful superstition, now I was accepted for the sacrament of holy baptism. I was a Christian. As I grew older, there came another day I remember. I went with one of our evangelists on a trip into the hills, and he told me his work was something like the lantern I carried. Jesus had told his disciples they must let their light shine before men, and he wanted to put his light so high it would be like a great lantern on a mountain shining over all of Africa, telling all of Jesus. And suddenly, I wanted to do the same thing. A long time later, there came another great day in my life. I was ready to enter the teacher's college. Here I learned to communicate what I had myself learned and to help my people in the way that I had been helped. At first it seemed a little strange, for at one moment we were pupils and then teachers. But quickly we learned the real joy of teaching, the pleasure of helping those who cannot help themselves. And we found, too, that as you teach, you learn. As time passed, our need for added space and equipment grew due to our expanding educational program. We hope that within the next 15 years, that 85% of our people will learn to read and write. At the girls' boarding school in the same town as my college, my fiancée was a student. Besides classroom subjects, the girls received training in skills and handicrafts. They also share in supplying food for their dining hall. They turn grain into flour in the slow and patient way that will be used for a long time to come in Africa, just as it has been done for centuries past. This is our running water. Sometimes it walks. This exercise is one of many that helps keep the students in good physical trim. We boys learned several exercises and games. Our favorite was football. We learned how to handle children on the playground as well as in the classroom, and how to make sure that they were following orders about washing hands. They say that cleanliness is next to godliness, but when you teach godliness, you can be gentle. Cleanliness sometimes requires you to be stern. So in the end, we could be very proud of the youngsters on whom we were practicing our teaching. Sometimes some of them were a little ragged, but they were always clean. For me, the proudest part of all was when I became a leader of the Boys' Brigade. 3,000 boys belong to this organization, which is part of the mission work here in Nigeria. It creates loyalty and patriotism among our young men. And because it is sponsored by the church, it brings many to a knowledge of God that they might not otherwise have had. That is why I always led my boys in a prayer at every meeting. These are the future leaders of our nation. And I know that if it is to endure, it must be a nation under God. With faith in God and adherence to the great truths of Christ, we of Nigeria can march forward confidently into the future. Not long ago, there came another great day in my life. There gathered people from all over this part of Nigeria. First came Muslims on horses like those of Arabia. And they joined Christians, heathens, all the different groups of this district. The occasion? Well, 100,000 of these people had elected me their leader in this region of Nigeria, and Christian and pagan alike had come to honor me. I will never forget that celebration. And the thing I will remember most is the prayer one of our own pastors gave for me. Not alone because of what he said, but because of the respectful way people listened, both Christians and pagans. I keep those people in mind always as I go about my district in my work as their government official. They showed their confidence in me when they gave me their votes. I must show them my confidence in God. That is why I spend all my spare time with the church district council. These are the men you might call our local missionaries, carrying the word of God to our own people, then coming back to report. One man may tell of a long trip he made to a far corner of our country. Not a successful trip. He found some men who were willing to listen to him, even though they were Muslims. And as he spoke to them of Jesus, he felt for a time that they were sincerely receptive, though they kept on fingering their strings of beads. But suddenly, one of them looked up at the sun and said a word to the others. And hurriedly, they all stood to face toward Mecca. It was time for their Mohammedan prayer. And so he realized that there, at least, his seed had fallen on barren ground. Another of our missionaries may tell a far different story. he too made a long journey to a far place, and he too met with what seemed to be a failure. In a village, he spoke to a group of people who did not seem to listen at all. Most of them even sat with their backs turned to him, and the women went on tending their babies as if he were not even there. But he did not give up. He kept preaching, although it seemed as if they were not hearing a word. And when he began a prayer, a miracle happened. They bowed their heads and prayed with him, for you see, they had been listening all along. So this man knew his seed had fallen on fertile ground. And the next time he came to this village, he surely would lead some of these people to Christ. Another man may tell of the wonderful progress our church is making in Nigeria, like this man reporting on the opening of our new evangelist school at Pella. The building of this school and its dedication were truly great events for all of the Lutheran faith. In the past, most of our schools have been supported by the missions, but this big and beautiful training establishment for our evangelists will be operated by Nigerians. It is proof of our confidence in the message of the gospel. The dedication began with a procession of the young men and women who will train here at Pella for evangelistic work throughout our nation. And I think you can be as proud of them as we were. After the procession, greetings from the American Lutheran Church and the Danish Lutheran Church were read to the gathering, an expression of love from countries far away. And then the doors to our new school were to be first opened by their representative, Dr. Rolf Serdo, of the Division of World Missions of the American Lutheran Church. And the papers of ownership were formally presented to President Akila Todi by the Reverend Pilgard Pedersen, the Danish mission leader. Truly, this was a wonderful report and a great and historic event. But as I told my fellow members of the Church Council, it was only a beginning. Despite all our progress, only about 8 people out of 100 in this district are Christians. We must not be satisfied until 100 out of 100 have found the Lord. We must remember the words of Jesus. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always to the close of the age. When the Lord is with us, who can be against us? Go out there, my brothers, and for the sake of Jesus and the salvation of our nation, bring our people to Christ.
So that is the story of Philip Maken, the true story of the way in which Christ changed one man's life, and the way in which he may well change the lives of millions more here in Africa, with our prayers, with our support. A new day is dawning over Africa. A new and promising future and a new concept of freedom are on the horizon. A future of freedom built upon the eternal truths of Christ, if we as Christians resolve that this shall not become the dark continent again.